This is the Ultrarunning History Podcast. I'm your host, Davy Crockett. Thanks for coming. This is episode 170. In this episode, I will continue telling the story of Old Sport Campana, the most popular ultrarunner of the 19th century, the clown of the pedestrian era. I recently released my new book on Amazon, The 6-Day Race Part 4, The Final Years of the Pedestrian Six-Day Race Era, 1888 through 1909. In it, I explain what happened to the 6-day race, why it stopped, and what happened to the fascinating ultrarunners of the 19th century. Get all 4 parts of this amazing history. Go to Amazon and search for 6-Day Race. In part 1, we became acquainted with Old Sport Peter Napoleon Campana, born in 1836, of Bridgeport, Connecticut, a poor street vendor and talented runner who wanted to become a professional pedestrian or ultrarunner. In part 2, by 1880, he overcame a bad reputation and had established himself as an odd anomaly in the very popular spectator sport of 6-day indoor races held in arenas in northeastern America. During that 17-month period in 1879 to 1880, he was the most prolific ultrarunner in the world. In August 1880, he was seen back on the streets in Bridgeport selling pencils. He had not yet won a race, but would almost always stick it out to the end of the 6 days, when usually 75% of the other runners would quit before the end. People would pay to come watch the races he was in, specifically to watch him run. Race directors would promise him a salary just to be in the races. No one ever could predict what unusual and amusing antics he would perform during a race. He seemed to never be formally training, but perhaps with all the miles he put in pushing his cart, he was able to regularly run more than 300 miles in a 6-day race. Campana was usually unbalanced. When some spectators mocked him, he would punch them in the face and then continue running. The crowds would roar with approval, and the race management would do nothing. The New York Times wrote,
Napoleon Campana, better known to the world as Old Sport, is called the clown of the walking matches, and a race without Old Sport in it would be a novelty.
The first pedestrian who tried to entertain people, and at times play the role of the clown as he walked for days, was the 6-day pioneer Edward Payson Weston of Connecticut. During the early 1870s, he would start his walks in a velvet suit and frequently interacted with the crowd to get attention. At times, he would try to win applause and create excitement by walking backwards, running, jumping, and performing many playful tricks to show how much energy he still had. But after a few years, he was not viewed as being endearing to the working class who came to the races in New York City. He gained a pompous and arrogant reputation and was called a humbug. One reporter wrote,
There are 2 things that we are opposed to, skunks and Weston, the walkist.
Campana came along 4 years later and received a totally different reaction. He clowned around like Weston did years earlier, but because he looked so old, people pitied him and did not overly criticize much of his outrageous behavior. Campana was seen as a destitute street vendor, while Weston was an ultra-rich aristocrat who lived in the finest hotels, spent money freely, and hobnobbed with the rich and famous. The working class identified more with Campana, who always returned to his street vending cart, and he became far more popular than Weston. Campana's eccentric nature was also seen in his personal life as a peddler in Bridgeport. His hot-headed nature would frequently end him up in jail. By 1880, his wife Jenny had apparently left him again. He still loved her deeply and had her name tattooed on his leg. Even with the money he received at races and his national popularity, He appeared to be nearly destitute because he spent his earnings so quickly, likely on a lot of alcohol. After being away from the sport for 7 months, Campana, age 44, came back in January 1881 to compete in the O'Leary International Belt, held in the American Institute building in New York City. Every seat within the building was filled by 10 p.m., 2 hours before the start. A sacred concert was put on with soothing music appropriate for Sunday.
Between the pieces of music, the sound of the busy hammers finishing the improvements in the building, the voices of sellers of programs about of the walkers, lager beer, peanuts, cakes, candies, cigars, and shooting galleries, try your weight, electric batteries, and a confused babel of thousands of voices filled the structure.
When Campana came out to the start line, he received huge cheers as spectators recognized him. At 12:05 a.m., 31 starters, arranged in 10 rows, were sent on their way with the word "Go" by referee William Curtis.
With a bound, the men darted around the track, the new men mostly at the top of their speed, the more experienced and knowing ones at a steady jog.
Early on, Campana kept up with the front runners. After 12 hours, he reached 56 miles, 8 miles behind the leader. On the next day, a cheer went up from all over the building, and then quickly changed to laughter.
Campana was seen wildly flourishing his arms over and around his head. He dashed forward at the top of his speed, past John Hughes, the leader, and then subsided into a slow and limping crawl. Bald-head Campana, with his punch-like face turned more to one side than ever, kept up the struggle gamely. About midday, a fellow on the beer side of the building made an insulting remark to Campana. "Go in, you old mackerel." The veteran straightened his head, placed his hands on the picket fence which separated the track from the spectators, and vaulted over like a circus actor. Stepping up to the loafer, Old Sport shot out his right hand, knocking the fellow down with one blow. Bounding over the fence again, Campana resumed his walk as though nothing unusual had happened.
By day 3, Campana continued to be the main attraction on the track for the spectators.
Poor Campana appeared to be about used up. He made sidelong lunges in his endeavors to keep on his feet after propelling them over 230-odd miles, looking wistfully at the long lines of spectators for expressions of sympathy. The veteran then left the track for a few minutes. When he reappeared, an astonishing change had taken place in his apparel. His limp undershirt and trunks were covered with a Prince Albert coat, and a fine silk hat came down almost to his ears. He had washed his face and brightened up.
He strolled from one side of the track to the other, amusing the onlookers with his assortment of odd facial expressions, and seemed to change his costumes every 15 minutes. He paid more attention to amusing the public by his antics than rolling up the miles. He had received more bouquets than any other man on the track.
On the 4th day, Campana ambled from one side of the track to the other, wearing an old white slouch hat, and making all sorts of odd faces to the amusement of the spectators. He reeled around the track apparently with no other purpose than to amuse the spectators. He changed his costumes nearly every 15 minutes, at one time appearing in a dirty suit of merino undershirt and red tights a world too wide. At another time in a gorgeous crimson suit and a black silk hat, but always with a soiled bandana handkerchief tied loosely around his long, scraggy neck.
On the 5th day, the race manager and pioneer 6-day walker, Daniel O'Leary, went on the track and ran once around with Campana, much to the delight of the spectators who cheered and clapped their hands. On the final day, Campana left the building unexpectedly to go drinking with some friends. The scorers assumed that he had quit the race. When he came back, he had to beg race officials to allow him back into the race, which they decided to do. Campana went back into his hut, but was brought back out again by applause.
He wore a disreputable felt hat and seemed as happy as though the race had been laid on the plan of a donkey race, in which the hindermost beast wins. He ambled, provoking sympathetic smiles.
Hughes broke Rowell's 6-day world record of 566 miles at about 6 p.m.
He ran around the track wearing an American flag. Campana trotted behind, holding a broom over Hughes' shoulders. Campana wasn't finished with his antics. When O'Leary brought out the O'Leary International belt and put it on the scorer's stand, Campana ran by and snatched it. O'Leary gave chase, and it took 2 laps before the trophy was recovered.
Hughes increased the world record to 568 miles. Campana finished with 525 miles. He didn't receive any winnings, but it was believed that he had received a salary of $50 to clown around during the race. He certainly firmly established the clown role during this race and seemed to enjoy it immensely. A month later, Campana competed in the 3rd O'Leary Belt in Madison Square Garden. For the pre-race runner meeting at the Garden, about 400 men and boys crowded the entrance to the building, and they immediately recognized Campana and cheered. As the runners prepared their huts for the race, the first thing that Campana brought in was a large mirror so that he could look at himself.
The veteran of the Tanbark was dressed in a red flannel shirt and a pair of trousers, and he handled this glass with the greatest care.
At the start, Campana purposely held back to be the last to appear on the track, which resulted in the desired huge applause. The 3rd O'Leary Belt 6-day race started on February 28, 1881, with 19 starters in front of 8,000 spectators. The New York Times wrote,
Campana is the same ridiculous clown that he was in the match in January. He has been paid to do the funny businesses of this remarkable show.
The New York Tribune added,
His bald head glistened in the bright light like a billiard ball. Whenever anyone looked at him, he would dart forward with renewed vigor, his arms and legs flying in all directions as if hung on wires.
On day 4, Campana, as always, hung in there and entertained the crowd.
He walks like a wooden toy manhole headpiece has got loose and whose arms need new pins at the shoulders. His head has got turned a quarter of the way around and has a lurch to the right. When he is presented with a bouquet, he holds it above his head and starts out on a keen run which threatens to topple his head from his shoulders and break him up generally.
On the last day, when Campana was really struggling and looked tired, Charles Rowell, the Astley Belt champion, came out of the crowd to encourage him and walked a lap with Campana. A ripple of applause followed them around the track. Campana reached 450 miles, which was needed to earn some of the gate money. He ran another lap, and as he finished, shook hands with the referee and retired. The crowd yelled, "Old sport!" He won less than $8. For the next couple of months, Campana visited high-profile races in the New York City area, but did not compete. At a 4-cornered 6-day race involving 4 of the greatest runners and walkers in the world, held at Madison Square Garden, he came out on the track uninvited and was very drunk. He was, quote, unceremoniously hustled out. During May 1881, Daniel O'Leary put on a 6-day heel and toe walking race at the large exhibition hall in Chicago, Illinois, that attracted some of the best heel and toe walkers in the world. O'Leary's friend, Campana, was invited to compete with the 27 starters. The race started on May 9, 1881, in front of 4,000 spectators. A negative Chicago Tribune reporter described the racewalkers as, quote, slab-sided, narrow-chested, stork-legged waddlers with about as much action to them as a duck on dry land. Charles A. Harriman of Haverhill, Massachusetts, took command of the race and reached 100 miles in 20 hours and 17 minutes. He set a 24-hour American walking record of 118.2 miles. Campana reached 93 miles. On the 4th day,
Old Sport Campana still hobbles around the track, looking every moment as if going to quit, but he expresses a firm determination to stay with the boys to the end. The soles of his feet were said to resemble porous plasters, as he tolerates no interference on the part of trainers and has a reckless disregard for blisters.
In the end, Harriman finished with a 6-day world walking record of 530 miles, beating O'Leary's existing 6-day walking world record of 519 miles, set in April 1877 in London, England. Harriman's 6-day walking record is still an American record today. As usual, Campana did not win any money.
Campana is left out in the cold, with only glory and sore feet, but he has been elected an honorary member of the Noble Order of Stags, and this consoles him.
Campana disappeared from the sport for the rest of 1881. There were only 2 other 6-day races held later that year in the eastern states. In August 1881, Campana went to Hartford, Connecticut, to run in a short race in the Charter Oak Park Picnic, but the weather washed the race out.
Finding nothing to do, he gravitated to the bars until his customary sure-footedness was gone and found himself being towed to the lockup by a policeman. It took the station house some time to realize that the unfortunate with a sort of wet rag consistency was the hero of the pedestrian track. A friend gave him $1.40 to pay his fare home, and he was put on the train early in the morning for Bridgeport.
In October 1881, he was arrested again at Danbury, Connecticut, and locked up for choking a small boy. In May 1882, another major 6-day race was held in Madison Square Garden, the Diamond Belt. During this race, George Hazael of England became the first person to reach 600 miles. Campana came to watch.
Some amusement was caused by the ever-present old sport Campana, who wanted to fight the man who rolled him off the bench on which he was sleeping, and was noisy because he could not identify him. The dilapidated pedestrian had been in the building since the start and had slept as little as though in the contest.
In June 1882, Campana turned into a hero in New York City. He jumped into the water and rescued a young man from drowning after the boy had tried to jump on board an excursion steamship after it had left the wharf. The youth fell into the water and sank 3 times before Campana jumped in and rescued him. At the end of July 1882, Campana returned to competition. He ran in the first Fox Diamond Belt, held in Boston's massive new casino building. A casino was a social club, not a place with slot machines. Richard K. Fox of New York City, the publisher of the Police Gazette, put together the 6-day race. The track was the largest for the indoor 6-day sport, 5 laps to the mile. The 6-day race began on July 31st, 1882, as Fox gave the customary word, "Go," to the 8 starters. The crowd of 5,000 looked small in the immense building. Campana fell behind a lap by the second mile. He reached 92 miles on the first day. On the second day, there were only 4 runners remaining. After Campana reached 200 miles on the third day, he went into his hut. About an hour later, he came out dressed in his street clothes, wearing a white stovepipe hat. When asked what the trouble was, he replied,
"Boss, I'm just a little out of my head, crazy-like. I am getting all right now, though, and when I get a little rest, I will come out and put in some good work."
On the fourth day,
Campana gambles along in the rear, apparently as happy as if he were not 100 miles behind the leader of the race. He covers the rear of the walking match with true soldierly persistence.
in the end, Campana reached 360 miles. He did not win anything, but a young lady admirer presented him with a gold ring. He became bitter that he had only been given $5 and felt that he had been treated poorly by the race management. A Boston newspaper wrote,
"We have always considered Mr. Campana as the ideal pedestrian of the world, and vastly more competent than any man we ever saw, heard, or read of to cover the rear of a walking tournament."
In January 1883 at Bridgeport, Campana, who was working peddling bananas and soda water, witnessed a terrible tragedy at Bridgeport. A 9-year-old boy sliding down a snow-covered hill ran into the path of a streetcar that Campana was on.
As the car crossed the foot of the street, one of the ladies pulled the bell to stop it. Just as the driver put on the brakes, those in the car saw the boy coming down the hill on a little cutter sled. They were all horrified to see him shoot under the platform of the car, which gave a jump and then stopped.
He was run over and instantly killed. After being away from the sport for nearly 3 years, Campana, age 47, competed in the Race of Champions 6-day race held in Madison Square Garden in April 1884. The race featured Charles Rowell of England, who came over hoping again to make a huge fortune. Madison Square Garden was spruced up for what would be one of the greatest 6-day races of the 19th century. Out of money, the citizens of Bridgeport paid for Campana's entry fee and expenses. He hoped to earn them a nice return on their money. He said,
"I am going into this race like a gentleman. I shall put old Clinton number 41 over my door, and that will be my battle cry for victory. I have made up a schedule of more than 90 miles a day. To do this, I shall eat food with plenty of blood in it. My daily rations will be 6 fish balls, 8 quarts of milk, and 3 quarts of beef tea."
The day of the race came. The New York Times wrote,
Napoleon Campana, better known to the world as Old Sport, is called the clown of the walking matches, and a race without Old Sport in it would be a novelty. He has been in almost every 6-day race in any civilized country for the last 10 years, was the most nervous man who visited the track before the race began. Almost all the afternoon he sat fidgeting upon his narrow bed within his little cottage.
He said he would have a big advantage over the other runners because he only needed 1 hour's rest per day.
"The rest of 'em are faster than I am, but I'm the toughest."
He said he had dependable trainers who would not tell him what to do. They would take care of him and wake him up each day. The runners came out on the track and were given the word go at 12:01 a.m. on April 28, 1884. An estimated 11,500 people watched the race in its opening hours, thought to be the largest crowd ever to be present at the beginning of a 6-day race. Campana led after the first lap. The excitement among the spectators was so great that they broke a high fence behind the reporter's stand. Police Captain Alexander Clubber Williams drove them back with his club. The first mile was achieved in 6 minutes 40 seconds by a group of 4, including Rowell. The crowd pressed onto the track, impeding Campana, who complained to the judges. Captain Williams soon cleared the track, and Campana began his clownish antics, leaping and shouting.
Campana bounds along in pink underclothes with blue trunks, and on his head wears a cap of white, trimmed with blue. He took considerable pride in a new pair of shoes that he donned on his 47th mile and showed them to the people hanging over the railing as he wriggled his loose-jointed frame around the ellipse. His lopsided head seemed in danger of dropping from his shoulders.
After Campana had run only 47 miles in 11 hours, Samuel Day, originally from England but living in America, who was leading the race with 74 miles, said something about Campana to another runner.
Campana, with a half-shriek, half-laugh, said, "Never you mind, Englisher, you'll have to swim home this time. You won't make enough to pay your way back." There was a general laugh, and Campana showed his tusks and laughed until his head seemed about to part company with his body. He is by far the most awkward man in the building, and he knows it. He grins with delight when the people laugh at him and shakes his fist at them good-naturedly. He plodded along as though he had got hold of some other fellow's arms and legs by mistake, and his thin face looked drawn and worn.
During the first evening, with only 71 miles, Campana said that he was done. He was suffering from colic.
"They will have to draw me out with a rope if they get me on that track again."
He was annoyed that people yelled at him when he slowed to a walk.
"They sing out, 'Run, you old fool, run!' I suppose the people of Bridgeport will be mad at me, but I can't help it. I don't much mind being called Old Sport, but I don't like the other name."
In the morning he was still in bad shape and complained about pain in his right leg. He believed he was through, but still wouldn't let his name be taken down from the scoreboard. People looked at the small figure opposite his name and laughed. He admitted that he had been in poor shape going into the race. In the evening, in citizen's dress, he went to the reporter's stand and said,
"I've been so disgusted and disheartened by the jibing of this crowd that I did not go further. As an old New York boy, I should have been treated with more consideration."
He refused to run in the race anymore and limped back to his hut. His name was taken down from the blackboard.
It was said that the old man had been put into his little fish and fruit cart and trundled back to his house by the sea. There were searchers on the track for some of his lost joints to preserve as mementos, but up to the time of this writing, they had found none.
Campana and his trainer stayed in the building trying to find funds to return home.
A drunken sailor wandered into the garden during the early morning hours, and 2 thieves got him into the bar room. They were appropriating his watch and money when Campana came to the rescue. The sailor generously handed him $3.
He now had money to return home. Patrick Fitzgerald of Long Island City, New York, went on to win the race and broke the 6-day world record with 610 miles. Word was received back at Bridgeport that Campana quit the race because the crowd had insulted him. Campana went back to peddling things from his cart. One day, while watching some teenage boys play baseball on a lot, he became offended by some of the remarks they made about him. He jumped from his cart and ran toward the boys, intent on clearing them off the field.
But the big lads were too much for him, and after they had rolled him around in the dirt and pounded him a little while, he escaped from their clutches, grasped each one by the hand, forgave them all around, and murmured, "Bless you, my children," and departed on a hop, skip, and jump.
For the November 1884 Connecticut senatorial election, 5 people wrote in Campana's name on their ballots. Stay tuned for more about Old Sport Campana. With that, this is Davy Crockett, and this is the Ultrarunning History Podcast. I hope you run fast and far, enjoy life, get outdoors, and most of all, stay safe and don't take unnecessary chances.